You know, it's an appropriate question because we are in an amazing situation. And what I mean by that is that wars between our nations are at a record low. Yet 1 in 122 people on this earth are fleeing a conflict. Why? Because there are over 30 civil wars underway as we speak tonight, including the one we're hearing about most these days in Syria. A civil war that has left 250,000 dead. It has displaced 6.5 million and created 4.5 million refugees. It has destabilized Europe because 50% of the refugees going into Europe are from Syria. Our administration, wanting to avoid another war in the Middle East, has not acted with conviction on this topic. And Syria is an example of what happens when the United States does not lead. The Syrian crisis becomes the European crisis, and the European crisis becomes the world crisis. U.S. policy needs to change and implement the following strategy. We need to establish safe zones in Syria to keep those people there and continue to give them that sense of country. But we need to protect those people from ISIS and even provide no-fly zones over those safe zones. For the refugees that have made it to Jordan and Turkey, we need to provide safe zones there. We need to provide assistance to our European allies to handle those refugees and to protect them from the right-wing politics of hatred. We need to take a stronger military step to defeat ISIS and other forms of terrorism in that area. And I think lastly, ladies and gentlemen, is that the United States, should accept its share of refugees. The United States has the most robust screening process in the world. And therefore, we should up the numbers of properly screened refugees allowed into this country. Because, ladies and gentlemen, how many times do we have to endure seeing photos of children and parents washed up, drowned on the shores of Turkey, as you saw this weekend in Time magazine that came out? We cannot remain indifferent to that carnage. We cannot remain silent towards these huddled masses. We've done that before. It's incumbent on us not to do it again. Yet when you listen to the Republican presidential candidates, the Republican Party, the party of my opponent, they make it a point to state that they will not do a damn thing. Chris Christie says ban them, even the kids. Fiorina says no more humanitarian efforts. Kasich says ban them and keep them out of Ohio. Carson says cut off federal aid. Rubio says we can't accept them. Bush and Cruz say ban them unless they're Christian. And Trump says ban them, and then if I'm president, I'll deport them. Of course he's going to say that. If that were my party's candidates, I'd stand up and I'd repudiate them. I'd repudiate that vitriol and that fear. We should accept our share of refugees who are fleeing violence. We must act in line with our historic tradition embodied by the Statue of Liberty. Ladies and gentlemen, it's the democratic thing, it's the humane thing, and it's the American thing. Thank you.
Well, I don't agree with those presidential quotes, those presidential candidate quotes, I should say. But I also don't agree that we can simply establish safe zones. And what my opponent said was keep those people over there. In fact, we have a moral responsibility to allow people who are fleeing from the use of chemical weapons, who are fleeing ISIS, who are fleeing religious persecution. We have a moral responsibility to allow them and to create refuge in the United States. And I'll tell you, this whole controversy started when President Obama announced that he was going to raise the cap to 75,000. And by law, he had to consult with Congress. Most of the time when the president has to consult with Congress, he just chooses to ignore those laws, right? Well then, the Secretary of State, John Kerry, with no authority, came out and announced that he was going to raise the cap to 85,000. Now, by this time, you can imagine that Congress is a little perturbed because they've just completely been dismissed in this otherwise congressional process. 2 months later, the Paris attack happens, and now everyone is concerned, right? And now we really do have a Syrian refugee crisis on our hands. But I'll tell you, this crisis started in the Obama administration. It started from an early departure from Iraq, from a Syrian red line that we didn't respond to, and then from a crisis in Libya. And now we have ISIS establishing a caliphate in all 3 of those countries and a presence in 33 other countries. So do we need to accept refugees? Absolutely. But we also need to make sure that we follow the proper process and the proper procedures. So let me tell you what that process looks like. It starts with the UN. Anyone who wants to come to the United States as a refugee is referred to the US by the UNHCR, the UN High Commission on Refugees. Then they have to be considered a special humanitarian case. If they are considered a special humanitarian case by the State Department, they get transferred over to the Department of Homeland Security. At that time, the Department of Homeland Security puts that applicant through biographic checks, biometric checks, security checks. It is a very thorough and robust process, but it's not a perfect process. But it's a process that we have to go through, and we have to take the time to do it, because it would be a mistake from a security perspective to treat refugees any differently than we treat anyone else who wants to enter the United States. This is an area where we need to be compassionate, but we also need to be prudent. And it also cannot just be a national level response. This is where we need coordination from the national level to state authorities to local authorities, so that our local police and local emergency response teams know exactly who's moving into their neighborhoods. That's the kind of coordination that hasn't happened under this administration, and blaming other parties isn't going to get it done.